You probably won't survive hearing what happened behind the white picket fence at 12 Hidden Valley Road. And honestly, most people who lived through it didn't come out the same. In 1951, when America was drunk on post-war optimism and the suburbs promised salvation from every possible evil, the Galvin family looked like they de-stepped straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, the kind that made neighbors pause on their evening walks just to admire the perfect tableau of American success unfolding behind those pristine windows. Don and Mimi Galvin had everything that mattered in Eisenhower's America. They owned a sprawling ranch house at 12 Hidden Valley Road in Colorado Springs, complete with manicured lawns that Don maintained with military precision and a backyard large enough for the organized chaos of 12 children. Don himself was the embodiment of American masculine ideals, a decorated Air Force officer who served with distinction in World War II, tall and commanding with steel gray eyes that could make subordinates snap to attention from across a room. His wife Mimi was equally impressive, a striking brunette with the kind of effortless elegance that made other wives feel underdressed at church functions. You walk up to their front door on any given evening in the early 1950s, and you'd be hit by a wall of sound that somehow managed to be both chaotic and harmonious. 12 children ranging from toddlers barely walking to teenagers preparing for college, their voices mixing in a symphony of American childhood that neighbors would later describe as magical. The sounds of homework being discussed over dinner, piano lessons echoing from the living room, the rhythmic bounce of basketballs against the garage door, and the constant chatter of siblings who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But you need to understand something fundamental about perfection. It's often the most fragile thing in any room, and the higher you build it, the more spectacular the collapse becomes. The Galvins weren't just successful, they were aggressively, almost defiantly perfect. Don worked at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, one of the most sensitive military installations in the country during the height of the Cold War. Every day, he drove through multiple security checkpoints to help coordinate America's defense against Soviet nuclear threats. His security clearance was so high that even Mimi didn't know the details of what he did in those underground bunkers carved into Cheyenne Mountain. The irony wouldn't become clear until decades later, while he was defending the country from external enemies. Something far more insidious was already growing inside his own home, written into the very DNA he'd passed to his children. Their house on Hidden Valley Road sat in a neighborhood that developers had marketed as the future of American living. Wide streets lined with young trees, houses spaced far enough apart for privacy but close enough for community, and mountains visible from every window as a constant reminder of God's majesty. It was the kind of place where children rode bikes without helmets. Doors were left unlocked, and the biggest worry was whether the Johnson's dog might get into your garbage again. You see their family photos from this period, and they're genuinely stunning in a way that seems almost too perfect to be real. 12 beautiful children lined up like steps on a staircase. Donald Jr., Jim, John, Brian, Michael, Richard, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and Mary. The boys all inherited their father's strong jaw and military bearing, while the girls got their mother's delicate features and knowing smile. They were altar boys who actually paid attention during Mass, Eagle Scouts who earned every merit badge, star athletes who played with both skill and sportsmanship, the kind of children who made other parents wonder what secret formula the Galvins had discovered. Mimi orchestrated their lives with the efficiency of a military operation, which made sense given her husband's background. Breakfast for 14 people happened at precisely 7 a.m. With everyone assigned specific roles, older children helped younger ones, dishes were cleared in rotation, and nobody left the table until everyone was finished. She maintained detailed schedules for music lessons, sports practices, and church activities, color-coding each child's commitments on a massive calendar that dominated the kitchen wall. Here's the quirky detail that makes this story even more haunting in retrospect. Don Galvin was obsessed with falconry, an ancient art that few Americans even knew existed. He'd discovered it during his military service and brought his passion home to Colorado Springs, building elaborate mews in the backyard where he housed hawks and falcons. Every weekend he'd take his sons to the prairie outside the city, teaching them to handle these magnificent birds of prey with the same precision he demanded in military operations. The children would watch in fascination as peregrine falcons and red-tailed hawks soared above their suburban neighborhood, completely free yet always returning to their master's glove when called. Don would explain the intricate relationship between falconer and bird, how trust had to be earned, how patience was essential, how these creatures could never truly be tamed, only partnered with. Metaphor would later seem prophetic in the most horrifying way: beautiful, powerful creatures that could never truly escape their genetic programming. no matter how much love and training surrounded them. The Galvin children excelled at everything they attempted. Donald Jr. was quarterback of his high school football team and maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at a local sporting goods store. Jim played violin in the school orchestra and was being recruited by several colleges for track and field. John showed artistic talent that had his teachers suggesting art school applications. Even the younger children displayed remarkable abilities. Michael could solve complex math problems in his head, while Richard had memorized entire passages of Shakespeare by age 10. By 1959, when Mary was born as the 12th and final child, the Galvin family had reached its full complement. Mimi had given birth to a child almost every year for over a decade, each pregnancy planned and welcomed with a kind of joy that made their neighbors slightly envious. The house on Hidden Valley Road buzzed with constant activity, homework sessions around the massive dining room table that Don had built himself, backyard football games that lasted until the streetlights came on, family dinners that required military-level coordination just to get everyone fed and seated. Don's career was flourishing. He'd been promoted multiple times and was now traveling frequently for classified missions that Mimi learned not to ask about. When he was home, he commanded the dinner table like a benevolent general, asking each child about their day, offering advice on everything from algebra, homework to girlfriend troubles, and maintaining the kind of paternal authority that kept 12 strong-willed children in line without ever raising his voice. Mimi had found her calling in managing what she playfully called her small army. She volunteered at church, organized neighborhood events, and somehow managed to attend every single school play, football game, and music recital that 12 children could generate. Other mothers would ask her for advice, and she'd smile graciously while privately wondering how anyone could find raising children difficult when they were blessed with such obviously exceptional offspring. You might think the first signs would be obvious when they appeared, but they weren't. Mental illness doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in wearing the mask of normal adolescent behavior until the day it drops all pretense and reveals its true face. When 14-year-old Donald Jr. started acting strangely in early 1965, it seemed like typical teenage rebellion magnified by the intensity that characterized everything the Galvin children did. He'd always been passionate, but now that passion had edges that cut. He became moody in ways that went beyond normal teenage sulking, withdrawn in ways that felt deliberate rather than developmental. Sometimes he'd explode over minor provocations, a spilled glass of milk, a younger sibling borrowing his pencil, with a rage that left the whole family walking on eggshells. He'd been their golden child, the one they pointed to as proof that their parenting philosophy worked. Quarterback on the football team, honor roll student, the kind of teenager that other parents used as an example when lecturing their own children about reaching their potential. But something was shifting behind his eyes, something that made his younger brothers instinctively step back when he entered a room. Some primal recognition that the person they'd grown up idolizing was becoming someone else entirely. The family doctor, a kindly old man who'd delivered most of the Galvin children, dismissed Mimi's growing concerns with comfortable platitudes that let everyone sleep better at night. "Boys will be boys," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never seen real mental illness up close. Growing pains, hormones, teenage rebellion, all perfectly normal for a boy his age, especially one under the pressure of being the eldest in such a large family. But you need to understand what Mimi was seeing during those long months as winter turned to spring in 1965. Her eldest son would stand in the backyard, for hours at a time, perfectly still among Dawn's falcons, staring at something that wasn't there. She'd watch from the kitchen window as he had animated conversations with invisible companions, his voice rising and falling in passionate discussion with empty air. Sometimes she'd find him in his room at 3 in the morning, laughing at jokes no one had told, responding to questions no one had asked, his eyes bright with a kind of manic joy that was somehow more terrifying than any sadness could have been. The breaking point came on a cold February morning in 1965, and you need to understand that everything that happened after this moment was inevitable, written in genetic code that no amount of love or prayer could rewrite. You're standing in the kitchen with Mimi as she prepares breakfast for 14 people, the familiar choreography of measuring coffee and cracking eggs suddenly shattered by a sound that will haunt her dreams for the next 50 years, screaming from upstairs that does unsound remotely human. This isn't the normal chaos of siblings fighting over bathroom time or someone stealing someone else's favorite shirt. This is something primal and terrifying, the kind of sound that makes every mother's instinct scream danger, while simultaneously pulling her toward the source. Mimi drops the spatula she's holding and runs toward the staircase, taking the steps two at a time while her mind tries to process what could possibly be wrong. What she finds in the hallway will become seared into family memory like a brand. Donald Jr. stands completely naked, covered in his own excrement, shouting at the top of his lungs about government agents who are coming through the walls to steal his brain. His eyes are wide and wild, darting between invisible threats that seem completely real to him. When he sees his mother, he doesn't recognize her. Instead, he backs against the wall like a cornered animal and screams louder, convinced that she's part of whatever conspiracy is pursuing him. The other children have emerged from their bedrooms, younger ones crying in terror while the older ones try to shield their siblings from seeing their beloved big brother in this condition. Mimi somehow manages to get a bathrobe around Donald Jr. while he fights her, all the while talking in a soothing voice that she hopes will reach whatever part of her son might still be listening. But you can see in her eyes the moment she realizes that the boy who taught his younger brothers to throw perfect spirals, who helped with homework every night, who never missed Sunday Mass, might be gone forever. Within weeks, Donald Jr. receives the diagnosis that will become the family curse: schizophrenia. In 1965, this might as well have been a death sentence. The medical establishment knew almost nothing about the disease, had no effective treatments, and offered families nothing but institutionalization and shame. Doctors spoke in whispers about mental defectives and suggested that Donald Jr. would be better off in a state facility where he couldn't harm himself or others. But Mimi Galvin refuses to abandon her son, and this decision, born from a mother's love and Catholic faith, will ultimately doom the rest of her family. She brings Donald Jr. home from the hospital and tries to maintain normalcy, while her eldest son cycles through periods of violent psychosis and medicated stupor. The other children learn to navigate around their brother's illness like it's a dangerous piece of furniture that can't be moved but must be lived with. Historians still debate whether the stress of watching their brother's mental disintegration triggered what happened next, but the timeline is undeniable and terrifying in its precision. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, 6 more Galvin sons develop schizophrenia over the following decade. Jim is next. In 1967, you watch him transform from a talented violinist who dreamed of playing in symphony orchestras into someone who insists that his instrument is possessed by demons. He smashes his violin against the living room wall during a family dinner, screaming that the music is controlling his thoughts. The sound of splintering wood and snapping strings becomes another traumatic memory that the younger children will carry for the rest of their lives. John follows in 1968, his artistic talents warping into elaborate conspiracy theories that he illustrates in disturbing detail. His sketchbooks, once filled with beautiful landscapes and family portraits, become filled with crude drawings of government surveillance equipment and torture devices. He becomes convinced that his art teacher is a CIA operative assigned to monitor his thoughts through his drawings. Brian's break comes in 1969, during his senior year of high school. The boy who once excelled at mathematics begins seeing patterns and codes in everything. License plates contain secret messages. The arrangement of books on shelves reveals government plots. Even the way shadows fall across the lawn holds significance that only he can decipher. He drops out of school 3 months before graduation, spending his days filling notebooks with incomprehensible calculations that he insists will save the world. Michael succumbs in 1971, and this particular version of the disease is perhaps the most heartbreaking because it comes wrapped in religious delusion. The boy who served as an altar boy and seriously considered becoming a priest begins to believe he is receiving direct communications from God. He spends hours kneeling in prayer, speaking in tongues and interpreting everyday events as divine signs. When the family tries to intervene, he becomes violent, convinced they're agents of Satan trying to prevent him from fulfilling his holy mission. Richard's illness manifests in 1973 with a paranoid focus on his own family. The gentle boy who once memorized Shakespeare for fun becomes convinced that his parents are trying to poison him. He refuses to eat meals prepared by Mimi, instead subsisting on food he can open himself from sealed packages. He installs multiple locks on his bedroom door and stays awake for days at a time, listening for evidence of family members plotting against him. By the mid-1970s, 6 of the 12 Galvin children are severely mentally ill, and the family has become a war zone where violence erupts without warning. You witness scenes that would break most families completely. Christmas mornings interrupted by psychotic episodes, birthday parties cancelled because one of the sick brothers is having a crisis, family dinners that end with police calls when someone becomes convinced the food is poisoned. The unaffected children, Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and Mary, grow up navigating a minefield of unpredictable danger. They learn to recognize the warning signs that indicate when one of their brothers is sliding into psychosis. The vacant stare, the muttered conversations with invisible companions, the sudden stillness that precedes explosive violence. They develop survival strategies that no child should need: how to barricade themselves in their rooms, how to call for help without triggering their brother's paranoia, how to disappear when the house becomes too dangerous. Mimi tries desperately to hold the family together, but you can see the toll it takes on her. The elegant woman who once effortlessly managed 12 children becomes hollow-eyed and brittle, jumping at sudden sounds and constantly calculating which child needs attention most urgently. She develops her own form of hypervigilance, always listening for the subtle changes in voice tone or footstep patterns that might indicate another crisis brewing. Don, meanwhile, begins spending more and more time away from home. His military career provides convenient excuses for extended travel, but everyone knows he's fleeing the chaos that has consumed his family. When he is home, he retreats to his study or works obsessively in the garden, unable to face the reality that his genetic legacy has become a nightmare beyond imagination. The healthy children suffer in ways that are perhaps more tragic because their pain goes unrecognized. All attention, energy, and resources flow toward managing the sick brothers, leaving little left for normal childhood needs. Margaret and Mary grow up feeling invisible, their achievements ignored, because their parents are too exhausted dealing with psychiatric emergencies to celebrate school plays or honor roll certificates. The younger boys learn early that their needs matter less than maintaining peace and preventing violence. Here is the quirky detail that reveals how desperately the family clings to normalcy. Throughout this entire decade of deteriorating mental health, Don continues his falconry practice. Even as his sons' minds fragment around him, he still tends to his hawks and falcons with the same meticulous care he always has. The healthy children sometimes join him for these sessions, finding peace in the predictable rhythms of caring for creatures that, unlike their brothers, follow comprehensible patterns of behavior. You start to understand that the Galvin family is caught in a trap that has no escape. They can't abandon the sick children because of love and Catholic faith, but they can't get effective treatment because it doesn't exist yet. They become isolated from their community because mental illness carries such stigma that former friends stop calling and neighbors avoid making eye contact. The house on Hidden Valley Road transforms from a symbol of American success into a prison where everyone is both captor and captive. The violence escalates throughout the 1970s as the sick brothers' delusions feed off each other. Donald Jr. convinces Jim that their parents are government operatives, leading to a terrifying confrontation where both sons barricade themselves in the attic, threatening to burn down the house rather than be captured. Brian begins leaving the house at all hours, sometimes disappearing for days while following the coded messages he finds in street signs and billboards. Michael's religious delusions turn increasingly dark, involving elaborate rituals that disturb even his deeply Catholic mother. What makes this period particularly tragic is that the family still experiences moments of normalcy that remind everyone of what they've lost. Sometimes one of the sick brothers will have a period of relative clarity, participating in family dinners or helping with household chores like the person he used to be. These glimpses of their former selves are both precious and heartbreaking because they make the return to psychosis even more devastating. The financial strain becomes crushing as Don and Mimi spend their savings on doctors, medications, and property damage caused by their son's episodes. Insurance covers almost nothing related to mental health, treating psychiatric care as a luxury rather than a medical necessity. The family goes into debt paying for private care, desperate to find someone who can help their children while avoiding the horror of state institutionalization. What you don't know yet is that while the Galvin family is drowning in chaos and despair, they're being watched carefully, systematically, and with the cold precision of scientific inquiry. In 1976, when 6 of the 12 Galvin children have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the family feels most alone and abandoned by the world, they receive a phone call that will change everything. The voice on the other end belongs to Dr. Robert Friedman from the University of Colorado, and he's calling with an offer that sounds like salvation, but will ultimately reveal itself as something far more complicated. You need to understand what the Galvin family represents to the scientific community. They are a genetic goldmine, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to study mental illness in ways that have never been possible before. Most schizophrenia research relies on unrelated patients with different genetic backgrounds, making it nearly impossible to isolate the specific factors that contribute to the disease. But here's a family with 6 affected children sharing the same DNA. The same environment, the same upbringing, a natural laboratory that researchers have been dreaming of for decades. Dr. Friedman explains to Mimi that the National Institute of Mental Health wants to study her family as part of a groundbreaking research program. They'll provide free medical care, cutting-edge treatments, and financial compensation for participation. After years of feeling helpless and abandoned by the medical establishment, Mimi sees this as answered prayer finally. Someone wants to help her children instead of simply warehousing them in institutions. But you need to see what's really happening here. The researchers aren't primarily interested in helping the Galvin family. They're interested in what the Galvins can teach them about the fundamental nature of mental illness. The family becomes Research Family 001 in what will become the most comprehensive genetic study of schizophrenia ever conducted. But the ethical boundaries of this relationship are murky from the very beginning. The study begins with an avalanche of interviews, tests, and medical procedures that invade every aspect of the Galvins' lives. Researchers arrive at Hidden Valley Road with clipboards and recording equipment, documenting everything from family medical history to intimate details about relationships between siblings. They draw blood from every family member repeatedly, building a biological archive that will be studied for decades. They conduct psychological evaluations on the healthy children, looking for subtle signs of mental illness that might predict future breakdown. What makes this particularly unsettling is how the researchers frame their work. They tell the Galvins they're participating in cutting-edge science that will help future families avoid similar tragedies, but they're also studying the family like specimens under a microscope. The children who aren't sick yet live under constant scrutiny, knowing that scientists are watching for signs of their inevitable mental collapse. Imagine growing up with the understanding that researchers expect you to develop schizophrenia, that your participation in normal childhood activities is being documented as potential early symptoms of future psychosis. The healthy Galvin children describe feeling like they're living in a fishbowl, their every action analyzed for scientific significance. When young Peter shows artistic talent like his brother John, researchers make notes about creative expression as a possible precursor to mental illness. When Matthew displays the mathematical aptitude that once characterized Brian, scientists document it as another data point in their genetic mapping project. The children learn to self-monitor in ways that rob them of spontaneity and joy, always wondering whether their current behavior will be interpreted as evidence of impending breakdown. Here est the quirky detail that reveals the strange intimacy of this research relationship. The scientists become so integrated into the Galvin family's daily life that they represent for Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, and family emergencies. Dr. Lynn Delisi, one of the lead researchers, spends so much time at Hidden Valley Road that the younger children begin treating her like an aunt. She witnesses psychotic episodes firsthand, helps restrain violent family members during crises, and provides emotional support to Mimi during the darkest periods. The line between researcher and family friend becomes increasingly blurred. The study expands far beyond what the Galvins initially agreed to participate in. Researchers want to examine not just the immediate family but extended relatives, tracing the genetic inheritance of mental illness through multiple generations. They interview grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, building a comprehensive family tree that maps psychiatric symptoms across decades. Some relatives refuse to participate, worried about the stigma of being associated with mental illness, but others are curious about their own risk factors and willingly provide DNA samples and detailed medical histories. Historians still debate whether the researchers adequately informed the Galvin family about the long-term implications of their participation, but the documentation suggests that consent was obtained through a mixture of hope, desperation, and incomplete disclosure. The family was told they were contributing to important science, but they weren't fully informed about how their genetic material would be used, how long the study would continue, or what rights they had to withdraw from participation. As the research progresses through the late 1970s and early 1980s, it becomes clear that the Galvins are providing far more value to science than they're receiving in return. The promised cutting-edge treatments largely consist of experimental medications with severe side effects and questionable efficacy. The free medical care comes with strings attached. Family members can only see doctors approved by the research program, limiting their options for seeking second opinions or alternative treatments. The financial compensation, while helpful, is minimal compared to the scientific value being extracted from their genetic material. The research reveals disturbing patterns that extend beyond simple genetic inheritance. Scientists discover that the Galvin family's environment itself has become pathogenic. The constant stress, violence, and trauma created by living with multiple mentally ill family members appears to trigger psychological symptoms in previously healthy children. This creates a feedback loop where genetic predisposition and environmental factors amplify each other, making it nearly impossible to determine where nature ends and nurture begins. You start to see how the research relationship changes the family's understanding of themselves. They begin to think of their lives in scientific terms, describing family events as episodes and manifestations, rather than simply heartbreaking moments of human suffering. The healthy children learn to speak the language of psychiatry, discussing their brother's symptoms with clinical detachment that helps them cope, but also distances them from their own emotional responses. The scientists make remarkable discoveries using the Galvin family's biological material. They identify specific genetic markers associated with schizophrenia risk, develop new theories about how the disease develops in the brain, and create research tools that will be used in psychiatric studies for decades to come. But these breakthrough insights come at an enormous cost to the family providing the raw material for discovery. The most troubling aspect of the research relationship is how it transforms family tragedies into scientific opportunities. When Richard attempts suicide in 1979, researchers document the incident as valuable data about self-harm behaviors in schizophrenia patients. When Brian disappears for weeks during a psychotic episode, scientists track his movements and interview people he encountered, treating his crisis as a case study in disease progression. The family's most private moments of pain become public scientific knowledge, archived in research databases and published in academic journals. The children who remain healthy live with the constant awareness that they are being monitored for signs of breakdown. Every mood swing, creative expression, or unusual behavior is potentially significant to researchers studying the family. This level of scrutiny creates its own form of psychological pressure. Imagine trying to navigate normal adolescence, while knowing that scientists are documenting your development as potential evidence of genetic disease expression. Dr. DeLisi and her colleagues published dozens of papers based on their work with the Galvins, establishing their careers and advancing scientific understanding of mental illness. The research contributes to major breakthroughs in psychiatric genetics and helps develop new treatment approaches that benefit thousands of patients. But the individual family members whose suffering made these discoveries possible remain trapped in their cycle of mental illness, violence, and despair. The irony becomes increasingly apparent as the study continues. While researchers use the Galvin family's genetics to unlock secrets about mental illness, they seem unable or unwilling to help the actual family members who are living with the daily reality of these diseases. The gap between scientific understanding and practical treatment grows wider, leaving the Galvins feeling like they're contributing to knowledge that will help everyone except themselves. By the early 1980s, the research has expanded to include brain imaging, advanced genetic sequencing, and psychological testing protocols that weren't even imagined when the study began. The Galvin family has become the foundation for an entire research empire, their genetic material stored in freezers across multiple institutions, their psychological profiles referenced in textbooks, their family dynamics analyzed in countless academic papers. What the family does unfully understand is that they've become immortal in scientific literature. Their genetic code and family history will be studied long after they read their most intimate details preserved in research databases that will outlast any of them. They've traded their privacy and autonomy for the hope of treatment that never quite materializes, becoming unwitting partners in an enterprise that values their contribution to knowledge more than their individual well-being. What you're about to discover will make everything you thought you knew about the Galvin family seem almost innocent by comparison. The genetic research, the scientific exploitation, the decades of mental illness, all of that was happening in plain sight, documented in medical journals and research papers that anyone could read. But beneath the surface of this already tragic story lies something far darker, something that the researchers either couldn't see or chose to ignore in their pursuit of scientific advancement. You need to understand that the house at 12 Hidden Valley Road was not just a laboratory for studying mental illness. It was also a place where unspeakable abuse flourished in the shadows cast by psychiatric chaos. While doctors were documenting genetic patterns and brain chemistry, while Mimi was desperately trying to manage 6 psychotic sons, while the family was being held up as a model of cooperation with scientific research, a different kind of horror was unfolding behind closed doors. The first hints emerge in therapy sessions with the younger children. Years after the fact, when survivors finally find the courage to speak about experiences they buried so deep that even they sometimes questioned whether they were real. Margaret, the eldest daughter, begins having nightmares in her 20s that feel more like recovered memories than dreams. Mary, the youngest, develops eating disorders and self-destructive behaviors that puzzle therapists until they start digging into her childhood experiences. What they uncover is a systematic pattern of sexual abuse perpetrated by the mentally ill brothers against their younger siblings, enabled by a family structure that prioritized managing psychotic episodes over protecting vulnerable children. You have to imagine what it was like for a 10-year-old girl, living in a house where 6 of her older brothers were experiencing delusions, hallucinations, and violent outbursts, and some of those same brothers were using their psychiatric symptoms as cover for predatory behavior. The abuse was particularly insidious because it was camouflaged by mental illness. When Jim would corner one of his younger sisters and engage in inappropriate touching, he'd claim later that he thought she was someone else, that his voices had told him to do it, that he couldn't remember what happened. The family learned to treat these incidents as symptoms of his schizophrenia, rather than criminal acts deserving of consequences. The same psychiatric diagnosis that generated sympathy and research funding also provided a shield behind which genuine evil could operate. Donald Jr., despite being the first to show signs of mental illness, was also the first to begin sexually abusing his siblings. The family's golden child, the quarterback who'd once been their pride and joy, discovered that his psychotic episodes provided perfect cover for violence and assault. When confronted about his behavior, he'd claim that government agents were controlling his actions, that he was being forced to hurt his siblings against his will, that the real Donald would never do such things. Here's the detail that reveals the true horror of the situation. The researchers studying the family were aware that sexual abuse was occurring, but they classified it as another symptom of the brothers' mental illness rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior that required intervention. In their clinical notes, they documented inappropriate sexual behavior and boundary violations as manifestations of psychiatric disease, using sterile scientific language to describe what were actually crimes against children. Brian's particular form of abuse involved elaborate psychological manipulation wrapped in his mathematical delusions. He would convince his younger siblings that they needed to participate in his calculations to save the world, using his supposed divine insights to coerce them into sexual acts that he claimed were necessary to prevent global catastrophe. The younger children, already traumatized by years of living with violent, mentally ill brothers, were easy targets for this kind of manipulation. Michael's religious delusions provided another framework for abuse, as he convinced his siblings that God was commanding them to engage in ritual behaviors that were actually forms of sexual assault. He'd use Bible verses and Catholic imagery to justify his actions, creating a twisted theology that transformed abuse into religious obligation. For children raised in a devoutly Catholic household, this religious manipulation was particularly effective and damaging. The healthy children Joseph, Mark, Matthew, Peter, Margaret, and Mary developed survival strategies that no child should ever need to learn. They learned to barricade their bedroom doors, to sleep in shifts so someone was always awake to watch for danger, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when one of their brothers was becoming predatory rather than simply psychotic. They created code words to warn each other about impending threats and established safe hiding places throughout the house where they could retreat when the danger became too immediate. Mimi, overwhelmed by the demands of managing 6 psychotic sons while cooperating with intensive scientific research, either could you want see what was happening or chose to believe that the abuse was part of her son's mental illness rather than deliberate criminal behavior. She'd been trained by doctors to interpret everything through the lens of psychiatric symptoms, making it almost impossible for her to recognize that some of her children's actions crossed the line from mental illness into criminal predation. The researchers, despite their intimate involvement with the family's daily life, failed catastrophically in their duty to protect the children they were studying. They witnessed inappropriate behavior, documented boundary violations, and recorded instances of sexual aggression, but they treated these incidents as research data rather than child abuse requiring immediate intervention. Their scientific objectivity became a form of moral blindness that allowed horrible crimes to continue under the guise of psychiatric symptoms. Don's absence from the family during this period takes on a much darker significance when viewed through this lens. His extended military assignments and frequent travel were uncageous escapes from a chaotic household. They were abandonment of children who needed protection from predators living in their own home. Whether he knew about the abuse and fled from his responsibility to stop it, or whether he simply couldn't face the reality of what his genetic legacy created, his absence enabled the continuation of horrors that might have been prevented by an engaged father. The younger children's psychological development was warped not just by witnessing mental illness but by experiencing systematic sexual trauma at the hands of family members who were supposed to protect them. They learned to dissociate during abuse, to minimize their own pain, to prioritize the needs and symptoms of their abusers over their own safety and well-being. These coping mechanisms, developed in childhood to survive immediate threats, would plague them for decades as adults struggling to form healthy relationships and maintain emotional stability. Historians still debate whether effective intervention could have prevented the abuse, but the evidence suggests that both the family and the researchers prioritized managing mental illness over protecting children from sexual violence. The psychiatric system of the 1970s was ill-equipped to deal with the intersection of mental illness and criminal behavior, often treating sexual aggression as a symptom to be medicated, rather than a crime to be prosecuted. The abuse created its own intergenerational trauma that compounded the genetic predisposition to mental illness. Children who survived sexual assault by mentally ill family members developed PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders that were often misdiagnosed as early signs of schizophrenia. The researchers, looking for genetic patterns in psychiatric symptoms, were actually documenting the psychological aftermath of childhood sexual trauma without recognizing the distinction. Margaret and Mary, the two daughters who survived to adulthood, would spend years in therapy trying to separate their genetic risk for mental illness from the psychological damage caused by childhood sexual abuse. They struggled to trust their own memories, to believe that their experiences were real rather than symptoms of inherited psychiatric disease, to understand that being victims of crime was different from being carriers of genetic illness. The scientific papers published about the Galvin family make no mention of the systematic sexual abuse that was occurring throughout the study period. The researchers focused exclusively on genetic factors and brain chemistry, creating a sanitized version of family life that ignored the environmental trauma that was simultaneously shaping the children's psychological development. This selective reporting represents a fundamental failure of scientific integrity that undermines the validity of decades of research conclusions. What makes this portrayal even more profound is that the abuse wasn't a side effect of the research. It was enabled by the research framework that prioritized scientific discovery over child protection. The same intimate access that allowed researchers to document genetic patterns also gave them the opportunity and responsibility to intervene when they witnessed criminal behavior. Their failure to act makes them complicit in crimes against the very children they were supposedly trying to help. The legacy of this abuse extends far beyond the immediate victims to affect how we understand the entire Galvin family story. What looked like a pure genetic tragedy was actually a complex interaction between inherited mental illness, environmental trauma, criminal behavior, and institutional failure. The children who developed psychiatric symptoms later in life weren't just expressing genetic predisposition. They were also manifesting the psychological damage caused by childhood sexual trauma that was ignored, minimized, and even inadvertently enabled by the scientific establishment that claimed to be studying their family for the benefit of humanity. You've witnessed the complete destruction of an American family, seen how genetic predisposition and environmental trauma combined with scientific exploitation and institutional failure to create a multi-generational nightmare that defied every assumption about nature versus nurture. Now you need to understand how this tragedy ultimately transformed our understanding of mental illness, while raising disturbing questions about the price of scientific progress that remain unanswered to this day. By the 1990s, the Galvin family had given researchers nearly 20 years of unprecedented access to their genetic material, psychological profiles, and intimate family dynamics. The scientific community had extracted an enormous amount of data from their suffering: blood samples that filled laboratory freezers, brain scans that revealed structural abnormalities, psychological evaluations that tracked the progression of mental illness across decades, and family interviews that documented every aspect of their lived experience with psychiatric disease. The research discoveries were genuinely revolutionary. Using the Galvin family's genetic material, scientists identified specific chromosome regions associated with schizophrenia risk, developed new theories about how the disease develops in the brain, and created diagnostic tools that are still used in psychiatric practice today. They proved that schizophrenia has a strong hereditary component, while also demonstrating that environmental factors play a crucial role in determining whether genetic predisposition actually manifests as clinical symptoms. Dr. Lynn Delisi, who had spent more time with the Galvin family than many of their own relatives, published groundbreaking papers that established her as one of the world's leading experts on the genetics of mental illness. Her work with the Galvins contributed to major advances in understanding how psychiatric diseases are inherited, how they can be detected early, and how they might eventually be prevented through genetic intervention. But you need to see the profound moral complexity embedded in these scientific achievements. Every breakthrough in understanding schizophrenia was built on the suffering of real people who received minimal benefit from their participation in research. The Galvin family members who survived into the 1990s were still struggling with the same psychiatric symptoms, the same cycle of violence and institutionalization, the same social isolation and family dysfunction that had characterized their lives for decades. The healthy children, those who had escaped genetic mental illness only to endure childhood sexual abuse enabled by the research framework, were left to rebuild their lives without adequate support or acknowledgement of what they had sacrificed for scientific progress. Margaret and Mary, now adults trying to establish careers and relationships, carried the psychological scars of growing up in a household where their safety had been subordinated to research objectives and their trauma had been misclassified as genetic symptoms. Here's the quirky detail that encapsulates the strange legacy of this story. Don Galvin's falcons, the birds of prey that had been his passion throughout the family's darkest years, outlived most of his sons. While 6 of his 12 children succumbed to suicide, overdose, or complications from chronic mental illness, the raptors he had trained with such meticulous care continued to soar above Colorado Springs, their genetic programming intact and their behavior predictably magnificent. The research empire built on the Galvin family's genetics continued to expand throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium. Their DNA became the foundation for studies involving hundreds of other families. Their psychological profiles were referenced in textbooks, used to train generations of psychiatrists, and their brain scans were analyzed using increasingly sophisticated technology that revealed new layers of neurological complexity. What emerged from decades of study was a picture of mental illness that was far more complicated than anyone had imagined when the research began. Schizophrenia was simply a genetic disease that could be predicted and prevented through DNA analysis. It was a complex interaction between inherited vulnerability, environmental triggers, trauma responses, and social factors that defied simple explanations or easy solutions. The Galvin family's story helped scientists understand that genetic predisposition creates risk rather than destiny, that environmental factors can either protect against or accelerate the development of psychiatric symptoms, and that the distinction between mental illness and psychological trauma is often blurred beyond recognition. These insights revolutionized psychiatric research and treatment, leading to more nuanced approaches to diagnosis and more effective interventions for families at risk. But the ethical questions raised by the Galvin research remain largely unaddressed by the scientific community. The family was never adequately compensated for their contribution to medical knowledge, never given meaningful control over how their genetic material was used, and never provided with the effective treatments that their participation was supposed to generate. They became unwitting partners in a research enterprise that valued their biological contribution more than their individual well-being. The researchers, despite their intimate knowledge of the family's suffering, failed to intervene effectively when they witnessed child abuse, failed to provide adequate mental health care for the affected children, and failed to acknowledge their own role in perpetuating trauma while studying its effects. Their scientific objectivity became a form of moral detachment that allowed them to document horror without taking responsibility for preventing it. Historians still debate whether the scientific knowledge gained from studying the Galvin family justified the human cost of obtaining it, but the evidence suggests that more ethical approaches could have achieved similar results, while providing better care for the research subjects. The researchers' failure to prioritize the family's well-being over their own scientific curiosity represents a fundamental violation of medical ethics that continues to shape debates about human subject research today. The surviving Galvin family members have received virtually no recognition for their contribution to scientific progress. Despite the fact that their genetic material and life stories form the foundation for modern understanding of psychiatric genetics, they live in relative obscurity, while the researchers who studied them have built distinguished careers based largely on insights derived from Galvin family suffering. The irony is profound and disturbing. A family destroyed by mental illness became the key to unlocking scientific understanding that has helped thousands of other families avoid similar tragedies. Their sacrifice enabled medical advances that they themselves never benefited from, creating a legacy that is simultaneously heroic and tragic. Contemporary psychiatric research has been shaped by lessons learned from the Galvin study, with stronger ethical oversight, better informed consent procedures, and more emphasis on providing direct benefits to research participants. But these improvements came too late to help the family whose exploitation revealed the need for reform. The genetic material extracted from the Galvin family continues to be studied today, stored in research facilities across the country and analyzed using technologies that didn't exist when the original samples were collected. Their DNA has become immortal in a way that their individual lives never achieved, preserved in liquid nitrogen while the people who provided it struggle with poverty, mental illness, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. What you need to understand about the Galvin family's ultimate legacy is that it represents both the best and worst aspects of American medical research. Their story demonstrates the extraordinary scientific insights that can emerge from studying genetic disease, while also revealing the human cost of pursuing knowledge without adequate regard for the welfare of research subjects. The advances in psychiatric genetics that emerged from studying the Galvin family have led to new medications, improved diagnostic procedures, and better understanding of how mental illness develops across generations. These discoveries have undoubtedly saved lives and reduced suffering for countless families dealing with psychiatric disease. But the price of this knowledge was paid by children who grew up in a laboratory disguised as a home, who endured abuse that was documented rather than prevented, who sacrificed their privacy and autonomy for scientific progress that never quite delivered the promised benefits. Their contribution to human knowledge is immense and largely unacknowledged, making them unwitting heroes in a story that history has yet to fully recognize or properly honor. The Galvin family's genetic legacy lives on in research databases, medical textbooks, and treatment protocols that continue to evolve based on insights derived from their suffering. But the individual family members who made these advances possible remain largely forgotten, their names absent from the scientific papers that built careers in advanced knowledge using their biological material and life stories. In the end, the Galvin family became America's most important genetic research subjects while remaining America's most invisible victims. Their contribution to scientific progress matched only by the magnitude of institutional failure that characterized their treatment by the very researchers who owed them protection, care, and recognition for their extraordinary sacrifice.